Good evening, everybody. And thank you, very kind. Since we do have two impressive guests, I will go directly to their bios very quickly and into our conversation. David Brooks. David became an open-ed columnist for the New York Times in September 2003. He is currently a commentator on the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC Meet the Press. He's the author of various books, and the last one, The Road to Character, made ~1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Nonetheless, he found a little time to be with us today. Mr. Brooks also teaches at Yale University, not tonight, and is a member of the American Academy of Art and Sciences. Born, I'm not sure I'm supposed to tell people how old you are, but that's fine. He was born in Toronto and graduated, we have some Canadians here, I guess, and graduated a Bachelor of History from the University of Chicago. He became a police reporter for the City News Bureau. He then worked at the Washington Times and then the Wall Street Journal for 9 years. He also served as a senior editor at the Weekly Standard for 9 years, as well as contributing editor for The Atlantic and Newsweek. So once again, please welcome David Brooks. Rusty Reno. He is the editor of First Things magazine. He was formerly professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University. He is the author of several books, including Fighting the Noonday Devil, a theological commentary on the book of Genesis, and the Brazos Theological Commentary on the Bible series. His work ranges widely in a systematic and moral theology, as well as in controverted questions of biblical interpretation. But also, Rusty found a little time to be with us today, and we thank him for that. Now, to save time and to avoid getting lost in words, we prepared a few questions, which are based on things that these friends have been writing about for quite a while. So, I'm going directly to the first question. The theme of this year's New York Encounter begins with the observation that we all have the intuition that life, even with all its hardships, is fundamentally good. And its original appeal is continuously being reawakened by things and people. This echoes a comment you made some time ago, David, when you said that we do not decide about life, we're captured by life. In the major spheres, decision-making, when it happens at all, is downstream from curiosity and engagement. However, we live in what Rusty has called a culture of disenchantment. In the most important sense, left us homeless. Nothing frames our lives. Nothing calls us to go outside ourselves in love. In fact, one could argue that the idea that we make our own reality is the very definition of the technocratic paradigm that has dominated Western culture for at least a couple of generations. Do you see any sign that we're finally moving past this mindset, that as a culture we may be starting to be captured by life again, to become re-enchanted?
Okay, first let me say what a pleasure it is to be here this weekend. I've been thinking a lot about, my mentor when I was young, 22, was William F. Buckley, and I worked at National Review, and I've been thinking a lot about those editorial meetings, because that was the last time I was in a room with so many Catholics. And it's been heartening to be back. And I should say that I don't come to you as the natural spiritual person that everyone else is up on this stage. There's a story I often tell. I grew up on 14th Street here, and my parents were somewhat left-wing and hippies. And in the 60s, they took me to something called a be-in, where hippies would go just to be. And to demonstrate that they were not captured by the materialism of society, they threw their wallets into a garbage can. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire from the garbage can, so I broke from the crowd, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. And now my line is I'm a conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. And so I don't come naturally to anything more spiritually elevated than the common culture. But there are some moments, and I'll just tell 3 quick moments, where we are captured. And I just want to give some examples. I do a show called The News Hour on PBS, and I came home one evening about 10 years ago, and I drove into my driveway in Bethesda, Maryland, and I saw my kids playing with a little beach ball in the backyard, and they were running across the yard to chase it down, kicking it up in the air, and they were giggling and tumbling all over each other. And so I pull into the driveway, and I'm just confronted with this unexpected tableau of family happiness. And I just sit there in the driveway, and I stare at it. And it's one of those moments that parents, and we've all experienced, where reality sort of spills outside its boundaries, and we're captured by a joy we know we didn't deserve. And those moments are, first of all, you want to feel worthy of such moments, but you also just feel overwhelmed by such moments. And it doesn't matter who you are, you all have those moments. I've had that. It often happens to me professionally, frankly. I'm a writer. The way I write is I have little notepads in my pockets, and I write my little notes on here. And then when I write, instead of just typing into the keyboard, I arrange the notes on piles in the floor. And each column may have 14 piles on my living room floor. And the process of writing is not typing into the keyboard, it's crawling around in my living room, arranging the piles. And some of those moments are the best moments of my job. And we've all had that. We're engaged in our work, and it just is flowing through you. It happens once every 7 years, but occasionally. And then, so those moments sweep over us. And then there are moments of love. And I could tell my own love story, but I'm going to tell somebody else's, which is a little more dramatic. There's a guy who cuts my fiance's hair named David. And he told her this story. And so there was a young woman in Houston who was a pianist, and she was going to move to San Francisco and be with her fiance. And she decides to get her hair cut before the move. So she walks into the salon. She sees David there cutting hair. She goes back into the changing room to put her gown on. She calls her mom and says, "I've just seen the man I'm going to marry." So she's sitting in the chair, and they're talking about life. And David says to her, "What are you doing?" And she says, "I'm a pianist. I'm about to move to San Francisco to be with my fiance, but I won't do it if you'll marry me." And so David paused, looked at his scissors, and said, I've never felt more free than I did at that moment. And he said, "It's a deal." And they've been married for 18 years. And so there are certain moments where we're just overawed. And that happens regardless of the official culture. And so my general view of society in this regard is that we are in a world where people are feeling overawed, trying to stay faithful to those moments, and then trying to understand those moments, but often not having the vocabulary or the equipment to do so. And the odd thing about our culture is we don't have a word for that longing. Some people use the word moral imagination or spiritual imagination. C.S. Lewis used the word joy, having a higher desire. Dorothy Day used the word loneliness, the loneliness for God. But we don't have that word. But I do think we're in a culture hungry for that sort of thing, with a utilitarian vocabulary that doesn't answer it. And to be blunt in this crowd, when somebody like Pope Francis comes along acting like Jesus, people respond to it, of any variety.
Thank you. Rusty.
It seems to me that was what David was saying, that we're arrested by the reality of things that do kind of overspill, and we're sort of smitten by it. But the danger is, or the threat is that we become so busy that we're not actually, you have to have your eyes open to see things. You have to be quiet to hear things. And it seems to me that in our time, the hearth gods of our society are health, wealth, and pleasure. And so the high priests of our society are medical experts, economists, and celebrity chefs. And so all three of those are not necessarily bad things, but they're projects for us. And so if I want to try to promote my health, I have to, I go to the gym and I'm working out, or if I want to pursue my career, I've got to buckle down and do the things that need to be done. Or if I'm trying to cultivate a taste for fine wine, I'm reading, Wine Spectator magazine or something like that. And that the project-oriented character of these endeavors make us think towards the future and not about the present. And so, I'm going to, as you pull into the driveway, the scene would not arrest you if you immediately started answering emails, which I fear so many of us do, where we feel that we're in bondage to these gods that we pursue. And I think that there's a war in our society at the present, or a kind of conflict between our native sense that the most enriching dimensions of life come to us, if you will, rather than things that we have to achieve. And worship is completely the complete antithesis of a project. It's not something we achieve, it's not something we work toward, but it's rather something that we make ourselves present for, to be present before God. And I think that this is one of the great gifts, I think, that the church can give to our culture at this moment, is to help to train people to be present before the things that actually matter. And of course, God matters most of all.
Feel free to react anytime. Your conversation is probably more interesting than my questions. So. No, but taken from where you left, another suggestion that we found in this year's theme is that in spite of our emphasis on self-reliance and control, today we seem to have a strangely hard time in relating with many aspects of life the previous generations did not experience as particularly problematic: love, work, decision, time management, even our own body. In many ways, we seem to be more fragile people. On this subject, I was struck by a comment that you made, David, a few months ago, when you said that emotional fragility seems like a psychological problem, but it has only a philosophical answer. People are really tough only after they have taken a leap of faith for some truth or mission or love. Once they've done that, they can withstand a lot. He also quoted Nietzsche: "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow." Would you care to explain that?
Sure. Just one comment on what Rusty just said. I do think distraction is becoming an epidemic. It's certainly in my life. I literally can't read a page or two of a book without going checking my phone. And if anybody wants to text me the Cowboys score as we go along, I'd be fine with that. I also think,
I've learned one of the things that we published a piece by Patricia Snow on the screen and the way in which the screen induces a kind of autistic-like symptoms. And what I've learned is to actually put my phone on airplane mode when I go to conferences. And it's made it much better that I can actually focus on what people are saying.
Yeah. I find them less interesting than you. But one of the things that struck me as also making it hard for us to be in those moments is abstraction and abstract language. Uh-huh. And that I keep hearing this phrase, personalism. One of my heroes, the other Messiah, is Bruce Springsteen. And he had this big hit with his third album called Born to Run, and then there was a 4-year gap where he couldn't produce a record because of legal problems. The logical thing for him to do would be to make a big national global album. And instead he retreated to New Jersey, to his town, and made a very local album, Trusting in His Landscape. And I went to see him in Madrid a couple years ago, and everyone had T-shirts from the Stone Pony, from Freehold, all these places in this town of Asbury Park. And I'm in the Madrid soccer stadium, and there are 65,000 people singing along, "Born in the USA, I was born in the USA." And I felt like looking at them, no, you weren't, none of you. But it's, if you create a landscape, Flannery O'Connor upstairs, if you create a landscape, people will come to your landscape and relate in that concrete way.
Do you know, actually, I think American popular music does this. I had an English friend who came, when he said he came to the United States, he wanted to go to Highway 66 because of Bob Dylan's album, as in contrast to the Beatles and Abbey Road. I mean, where is Abbey Road?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
There's a way in which our musical imagination is very much rooted in place. I think that's a great strength, and I agree with you. It helps a lot.
Yeah. I also thought I'd wind eventually back to the question.
No, unless we want to talk music. I love the blues. I don't know if you want to introduce another factor here.
Okay. No, anyway. I had a few Madonna jokes go through my head, but not risky. Too risky. So on the fragility, which I do think is real, I teach at Yale, and I joke about my students, they're all awesome. They're Yaleys. My joke is when I ask them, what are you doing for spring break? It's like, I'm going to unicycle across Thailand while reading to lepers. They're all amazing. But there's a fragility there, and a fragility up and down whenever you go to any kind of college, and more so than I think earlier. They're also way more accomplished than anybody was when I was in school, but more fragile. And so what explains the fragility? Some of it, I think, is conditional love. It's so competitive to get into schools and to succeed that the parents, some of them, are beaming love at the kid when they do something they think will lead to success, and withdrawing love when they think they're doing something wrong. And those students have fear at the core of their souls, because the ultimate relationship of their life is conditional on them behaving in a certain way. Some of it is just this weird moment of 20 to 30, where where you used to, in 1974, I think it's 60 or 70% of people 25 had bought a home, had kids, job. Now people, especially in this kind of town, do that at 32 or 38 or 40.
Right, that's early, 32.
Yeah. And so they go through this life of trying on different things while their parents go quietly insane. And it's a time of great turmoil. I've had 5 or 6 research assistants in my current job, and almost all of them have had major romantic breakups a few weeks after I hired them. And I think that's just the nature of that age. And in my experience, people in their 20s underinvest in friendships and overinvest in other things, and so don't have the networks. And then finally, there just is a loss in the ability. People were really good, trained in how to do things, but why to do them, that's a question we in the universities don't train. And so what is my highest life? What is my highest love? That's a question we almost actively discourage. And so when the bad stuff happens, then there's just not only a psychological crisis, not only a relational crisis, but you get an existential crisis. I don't know what my purpose is.
Right.
Rusty also wrote about these things.
I think that we underestimate the blessing of the given, and that there is less and less for young people that is given, and so that therefore the horizons of possibility become overwhelming. I mean, I'm just old enough to have been born and raised to see life as like a train ride. It's got all these different set stations, and the train goes down the tracks from one station to the next. You go to college, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, you retire, you die. And that you could take side trips, as I did. I certainly took side trips, but I could always count on that train track taking me to the next stop. And there's a kind of givenness to the pattern of life that was a blessing, because it actually created more freedom for me than the current situation. And I was having lunch with a friend of mine he's really not that much younger than I am, but young enough, and he said, oh, no, that's not what life's like. Life, he said, is like being on a sailboat, and you have to tack back and forth to get to a destination of your own choosing. And I just thought to myself, wow, that must be really hard to have to go through life piloting your boat against fickle winds back and forth. And I think that's one reason why you find with this paradox of a younger generation that I agree with you, David, they are so accomplished and they're so well trained and they're so much more kind of on the ball than I was at that age when I was sort of drinking my way through my undergraduate career. But at the same time, there is a way in which they have all these opportunities, but they have so much less freedom. And they're so much more fearful of making mistakes. I tell my students in the office, the young people at the office that work as interns, that we do not live in a hedonistic age. Hedonism is not caring about tomorrow. And when I was a college student, very few of my friends thought about what they were going to do after they graduated from college. And they were all freaked out in their senior year. I don't know if this happened to you, but everybody's freaked out. And now what am I going to do? And I got to get a job. Oh, geez. And they all did fine, and many of them are quite successful. Whereas now, young people, you're 18, and you've got this whole roadmap ahead of you. And you're very anxious to make to the next stage, and you got to get all the credentials in just the right order. And I think that this must be very, very difficult. So there's something about the givenness of things that is a real blessing.
One of the real motifs of this conference is the word freedom, which has really struck me. I didn't expect to come to Catholic Gathering and there'd be so much talk of freedom.
Too much freedom.
I don't want to say what my knowledge, I went to the University of Chicago, as you mentioned, where we read Aquinas and Augustine, and the saying about the University of Chicago is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. That's but the freedom, especially as it's been used in this movement, is a really challenging kind of freedom. And it's not freedom from, it's not the liberation from events. And I think one of the things, especially students who are gifted and have opportunities before them, naturally enough, want to keep their options open. And they have FOMO, and they want to preserve, they want to see what's out there, and they're terribly afraid of making the wrong life, legitimately enough. But the thing you notice, especially as the 20s were on, is that those who commit their lives to a lot of different options dissipate their powers, and their life doesn't actually amount to anything. And that the higher source of freedom is chaining yourself down to things. Tim Keller, across town and a denomination away, says freedom is not absence of restraints, but choosing the right restraints. Or as the way I would put it, life should be a series of moves from open options to sweet compulsions. And choosing those obligations and those duties does lead, like if you practice piano and you chain yourself to piano, you have the freedom to actually play it. But having a mentality where you say, what am I going to chain myself down to, is sort of a radical difference from the way we talk in our culture today.
I mean, the sweetest compulsions are the compulsions of love. And so it's our loves that bind us. I mean, we all feel that love, that's a kind of common way of talking about being compelled and feeling compelled in love. And so it's a kind of bondage, and I think we've all felt the bondage of love, but it's a very sweet bondage. And it empowers us, and it energizes us to go and do and to serve something higher than ourselves, greater than ourselves, or outside of ourselves. And this is, I think, the real source of freedom. Because freedom is not always so much about being able to do what you want, or maybe more accurately, freedom is the ability to do what you want. But there are many powers abroad in society, principalities and powers, that want us to do what they want, you know? And so having the power, having the ability to do what you genuinely want really requires a kind of strength of soul, a kind of steeliness of purpose that I think comes from the bondage of love, being bound in love. So it's the paradox of love, which it both binds us and it also frees us. Yeah.
Mentioning, I live now in Washington, the most emotionally avoidant city on earth, and we don't talk about love. And I do think being willing to talk about it. One of the things that's going to a secular audience is different than a faithful audience, is the talk of love and relationships is sort of in the air here. But it's not in the air in a lot of places. And I just did this book tour 2 years ago, and the book is about Dorothy Day's intimate life, or George Eliot's love with her husband or partner, or whatever you want to call him. And it's mushy. It's very mushy. And I would give talks at conferences of extremely boring middle-aged white businessmen in gray suits. And I'd walk into the conference, and I'm about to talk about George Eliot's overflowing passion for this guy, George Lewis. And I would walk in, I'd look over these gray faces, and I'd think, this is not going to go well. But when you give them the chance, then they lean into it, and there's a quality of silence that I've never heard at any other point in my career. And so that's why I started by talking about that hunger that's in the culture waiting for sustenance. And the difficulty is talking into it. And so I'm a secular writer. How do you talk about sin? How do you talk about grace? How do you introduce these concepts in where it isn't there? I actually spent a lot of time thinking about that.
How do you do it?
I'm glad you asked. So you don't lead with God. The way you do is you try to, these concepts, the Gospels are filled with wisdom that's practical and useful and real. And so there's always a way to translate it into a secular language. So for example, with grace, we all say, we've all been sick or had family members sick. And when you're really sick, some people show up for you. Some people don't, who you thought you would. But then some people you barely know show up for you. And they shock you with how beautiful they are to you. That's unmerited love. Sin, that's a tough one. I was on Charlie Rose just before my last book came out, and I was talking about my book, and I was talking about how much we lost when they lost the concept of sin. And I got an email from an editor not at my house in New York, and he said, I love the way you talked about your book, but I wouldn't use the word sin. It's just dark. Use the word insensitive. And I thought...
Use the word what?
Insensitive.
Oh, insensitive, right.
You know.
Thoughtless.
Hitler was so insensitive. But so then I tried to think, how do you say it? And again, to quote Tim Keller, you use Augustine and the concept of disordered love. That we all love a lot of things, but we know some loves are higher than others. And if a friend tells you a secret at a dinner party and you blab it to everyone else, you know you've put your love of being popular over your love of friendship, and we all know that's wrong. And so sin doesn't become this depraved thing from the Garden of Eden or something. It becomes a mix of a perversion of good things. And that's at least a way to begin the conversation. And then you can go deeper as things go from there.
And I think also with sin, St. Augustine also sees us enclosed in upon ourselves. And I think people have a sense of their own bondage to themselves, and they want to get outside themselves, and they would like to be more engaged with their the people they love and the people they care about. I certainly look back on my career as a college professor when my kids were small, and I realized that I misprized. I had a disordered love. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, in fact, it's a good thing to try to write good books and, and say things that are of use, perhaps, in the public. But I shortchanged my kids. I can look back and see how I shortchanged my kids when I should have properly. And I think people really have a very intuitive sense that that's an affliction, that we're enclosed in upon ourselves and cannot respond to others.
I'll take another step. We'll try to take another step, which is, okay, where is that these things can be discussed, shared? And I'll take from something you wrote, David. There are fewer places in public where people are talking about the things that matter most. As a result, many feel lost or overwhelmed. They feel a hunger to live meaningfully, but they don't know the right question to ask. the right vocabulary to use, the right place to look, or even if there are ultimate answers at all. He also said that everyone is born with the moral imagination and need to feel that life is in service to some good. The task now is to come up with forums where these sorts of conversations can happen in a more modern, personal, and interactive way. Here we are. That's what we're trying to do.
Mission accomplished. We're done. Yeah, no, I do think, I'm a political pundit talking head, and we've got 1 million shows on TV. To every tweet that Donald Trump does, we regurgitate it on CNN for 6 hours. And yet the things that really matter that are the subject of this conference, they're not on TV. They're often not on the radio, and they're just not in the public sphere. And my shorthand take on what's wrong with the culture is that we should become more communitarian when we're too individual. We should become more moralistic when we're too utilitarian. We should become more spiritual when we're more material. And we should become more emotional when we're too cognitive. And one of the nice things faith communities do is they put the heart first. They, as Augustine said, we're primarily not thinking creatures, we're desiring creatures. And I do think there's a style of discourse that is common within Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Catholicism that is just not common in the common culture. And that's why I insist that it's right to talk obscenely openly about emotion, which is something, believe me, it's not natural to me. My joke is that my friends would say me talking about emotion is like Gandhi talking about gluttony. It's not my natural thing. But unless you are personal about it, unless you are open with emotion and emphasizing how the emotions really are the guiding features of our lives, then you're not really talking about the real stuff. I teach this course, and I'm sure everybody in this room has read The Long Loneliness, Dorothy Day's book. And I teach 14 books in one course. And the final assignment is that pick any of the 14 books and apply it to a problem in your own life. Out of my 24 students, 19 of them chose The Long Loneliness. They're transfixed by Day. Now, why is that? It's because she overflows with emotion and turned an early life of chaos into a life of committed service. And that's sort of the magic formula. And my favorite moment in the book is where she was about to give birth to her daughter, and she realized that all the accounts of childbirth that she'd ever read were written by guys. And so she thought, I'm going to write one. And 40 minutes after the birth, she wrote an account of what it felt like and published it in the New Masses. It's a very beautiful essay. And a lot of it is about the pain and the fire and the eruptions of the pain. But then at the end, and I'm going to butcher it a little if I can still remember it, she wrote, if I had written the greatest symphony, written the greatest novel, composed the greatest symphony, or sculpted the greatest sculpture, I could not have felt a more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. And she talks about the vast flood of love and joy that overwhelmed her at that moment. And she said, with that, I felt a need to worship and to adore. And she didn't know what to worship and adore. But she then found God, created the Catholic Worker, worked down here for 60 years. And if you go on YouTube, some of her late television appearances are on there. And there's just a spareness and stillness to her presentation. And I think that stillness is what, in a frenetic world, that is so attractive. But what is so striking about her is the intense emotionality of her life all the way through. And it grips people, and it supplies people not only with a way to live, the way to talk about it, and then a way to live it out. I'll just tell one more of my favorite Dorothy Day story, if I can remember it. At the end of her life, Robert Coles, a guy who teaches at Harvard, asked her, are you going to write a memoir? She was a great writer. It would have made sense to write a memoir. And she said, I thought about it. And so I sat down with a piece of paper, and I wrote at the top, A Life Remembered. And I sat there thinking, and I thought of the Lord and his visit to us those many centuries ago, and I was just so grateful to have had him on my mind. And she decided, don't need to write anymore. And again, a great, beautiful stillness that flows out of an emotionally volatile nature. how you turn that alchemy is so attractive. But you got to be open about the emotionality in the public culture.
I think one thing we need to think about is, well, how do we get to this point where we can't respond to such evident fullness of humanity? And I think part of it is that we're trained to try to understand things. You know, so if you're at Yale as an undergrad, or if you're a talking head on TV, you're supposed to explain to people what's really going on. And I think we live in a society that is, the consensus is that the most real things are material. And so we're metaphysically a materialist. We're almost all of us metaphysically materialists. So if I want to explain something, if I want to explain why somebody in Ohio voted for Donald Trump, I got to explain their motives by going down. And so I've discovered, as I've been in fora and talked, you know, been with people and had discussions, that there's a consistent downward move of reduction to economic interests, or identity politics are the most popular ones, but it could be, you know, some kind of debased Freudianism of some sort as to what motivates people, or it could be a Darwinian explanation of how natural selection leads to people wanting to do it this particular way. But classical thinking typically says that, well, our ordinary perception of things for Plato is not accurate. I mean, we are deceived. So our encounter with reality needs to be refined and purified, so that we participate in it more fully in an intellectual way. But for the classical tradition, you go up, not down. And so instead of saying for Plato that our misperception is we don't see it in its fullness, the beauty of things, or the truth of things, or the goodness of things. And I think that we discipline ourselves when we're talking to our friends and neighbors about politics or what's going on in the world, that we start to ask ourselves, what are the higher things that people are in an inchoate way seeking? And I think in the current political environment, where, you know, especially with, you know, the soon-to-be inaugurated president, the people who voted for him, the initial impulse is to just insist that there's just something that's always going down. And we need to think about what is it that people are missing, that they're trying in an inchoate and perhaps perverted way, trying to recover or return to or grasp. And I think that that's a more ennobling way for us to think about our differences and our controversies and our debates, and could help us, you know, recover some of the spiritual things when we're too material, and the emotional things when we're too intellectual. So I think that going up and not down, that's an important move to make intellectually.
Yeah, there's a French writer, Denis de Rougemont, who said, "That which is lower we take to be more real," which is exactly that.
Right.
And I should to apply it practically, I quote you in all the time. I think you have the single best phrase of this election season, where you said we're suffering from a crisis of solidarity. Mm-hmm. I give you credit 69% of the time. And mostly
I'll take it.
Just steal it. But because when you know, the average Trump voter was making $74,000 a year. So it's not necessarily just a sense of economic deprivation, but communal deprivation of hope, and mostly a deprivation of intimacy and relationship in society. And that you would speak to them, and there are so many people who, if you made a middle-class income, you weren't the richest guy in the world, you weren't the most famous guy in the world, but you had a certain respectability and dignity in your culture. And now with the celebrification, if you're not rich and famous, you're nothing.
Yeah, you're either going up or you're going down,
right.
Sadly, in our current
and somebody
time.
put it recently to me well, which is, we have one story of success in our culture: go to college, get a white-collar job. Mm-hmm. And if you don't fit into that story, then you feel the whole culture is just dumping on you.
And I think the feeling of homelessness that people have is very powerful. I was at a discussion, I was at a conference in Europe over the summer, and this young French woman made a very impassioned speech, and the topic was immigration. And she said she wasn't wealthy, because she was a school teacher, and therefore she couldn't, unlike rich French, couldn't live in neighborhoods that were just French, but had Muslim neighbors. And so she knew about Muslim culture in France, and she said that her Muslim neighbors cherish the opportunity, as they do on vacations, to go back to Tunisia and Algeria, and they speak of it as going home. And her voice quavered, and she said, "If I lose France, where can I go?" And I thought, wow, that is an explosive fear, and not to be discounted, and that we do need to think about how we can together create a place where people feel at home. And I think that's a really important imperative in what I think are kind of coming political crises. I think the United States were in much better shape, but potentially political crises in Europe. This sense of homelessness. What can I trust? Because I think family, the domestic realm, church, the spiritual, religious realm, and then that sense of belonging someplace in the world that has a discrete history, a topography, a way of talking, a way of communicating. I think it's a very powerful human need.
Okay, this brings us to our nation. In a few days, we will have the presidential inauguration. We should also reflect about the state of our nation in general, in a broadly political sense. Of all the themes that emerged during the electoral season, we found the discussion about identity particularly interesting. It seems to us that many times the emphasis on identity politics does not reflect the fact that our cultural, religious, and ethnic identities are particularly strong, but rather that they are weak. Paradoxically, all the talk about diversity seems to have provided ideological cover for a progressive impoverishment of cultural identities. Nonetheless, people need to belong, as we were saying, and therefore cling to what you, David, called one-dimensional identities, which, however, only divide people, never unite them. Rusty recently wrote that what's striking about our culture right now is that it seems unable to review or even sustain solidarity, the shared sense of belonging that allows us to feel at home in the world. David also said that after the elections, we need to rebuild the sense that we're all in this together, and that rebinding the nation means finding shared identities, not just contrasting ones.
Well, we're about to inaugurate a man who represents the Christian virtues in the highest. Wow, people really believe that. I think, well, it's a question for all of us, especially for people of faith. I think my fiance had a good line that the word evangelical has gone from an adjective to a noun. That is to say, from a way of living to an identity group. And I think that may be true of Catholics as well, and Jews, that it's become a tribal group rather than a way of being. And I do think the multiplication of identity it gives us things which are both real and tie us down, but also allows for overlapping sharing. And one of the problems I found with this election is that we have a race between populists who are very tied to a specific, I think, monocultural identity, often the professional multicultural people who have a mono identity, and then a globalism which does not know how to speak intelligently about nationalism and patriotism, which leaves you almost spiritually devoid and without identity. And the sad thing is, this is a problem our founders already solved. And that one of my heroes is Alexander Hamilton, who's a Latino hip-hop star from the Heights. He had a fervent Christian sensibility, a fervent American sensibility, a fervent immigrant sensibility, and every human being I know actually has all those things within them. And then it can relate to different people on different levels at different times, depending on the different settings. And that's, there's a guy who wrote, Multiply Your Associations and Be Free. And I'm sitting here, I'm so moved by this group and by the size of this movement and how it grew from one guy's writing. It's actually kind of amazing. I'm frankly moved by the youth of this group. And I'm sitting here thinking, you know, we really need more movements like this. And because there are so many Italians around, I'm thinking, we need a Christian Democratic Party. And I don't mean in its late decadent phase, but a movement that is democratic and capitalist, but infused with Judeo-Christian values, both in how we treat capitalism, how we treat freedom, and mostly how we treat the issue of solidarity. And so I'm ready to sign up if you guys want to run.
Go, Rusty.
Yeah, I'm not sure a Christian Democratic movement can work in the United States, but I like the sentiment. I mean, when people talk about things like diversity, I think what they really mean, what they really hunger for is solidarity. So we have this room full of people from many different places, many different countries, many different backgrounds. But we're united in a common love. And solidarity is unity in a common love. And it's a shoulder-to-shoulder experience, not a face-to-face experience, as we work to try to achieve something together. And one of the, I mean, we've been kind of circling back that there is a kind of crisis of love or impoverishment of love in our time. And that's true for, it's not just true at the romantic level, interpersonal, and our anxieties. Young people have anxieties about whether this is the real person I really love, and they can't make up their mind. But also we have a certain impoverishment of civic love. And I think Lincoln's first inaugural address, when he talked facing, you know, I think South Carolina had already seceded from the Union, maybe a couple other states had, and he hoped that there was some way to reunite based on what he calls the mystic chords of memory. I strongly resist the idea that the United States is a propositional nation. I think that is a fallacy, that we actually share a common life together, a history, memories, and we're very blessed that it's a very capacious memory that invites others into it. But it's something that needs to be renewed in every generation. And I think one reason that we are in a state of polarization in our country, there's important things at stake, and democratic politics is always one of contestation. But part of it is a lack of attention to renewing what it is, what our shared love is. And my beef against multiculturalism is not that it I think the desire to try to create a welcoming environment for people from many different backgrounds is a noble thing and a worthy thing, but that ideology refuses to actually articulate what the common love is. And because the assumption is that a shared love is always exclusive in some regard, and it is to a certain degree. It can only include those who share the love, and love is particular in its orientation. And so I'm not sure I want to sign up for the Christian Democratic Party. There was a Solidarity Party, but I'm not sure it was how serious it was.
That was in Poland.
That was in Poland.
You know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the way the habits and the mentality and the spirit of faith can inform political life in ways we don't always think about. And I was up in the Metropolitan Museum of Art many years ago with a friend of mine who's not a direct descendant of George Washington, but a descendant of George Washington. And we were looking at Peale's portrait of Washington, and he said to me, "What is it like for you? Because they call him the father of your country, but he's literally one of my forefathers, but he's not the father of you, because your parents weren't here." And I realized I never thought of that. I always assumed he was my father too. And it didn't occur to me that I'm not actually related to him. And so one of the things, it's a habit to think that our forefathers are in some part of spiritual communion with us. And then I would differ in you whether America is a creedal nation, but I would emphasize that it's an eschatological nation, that we're the last best hope of earth, that we're not always joined by a common past, but we're joined by a common future. And that eschatological frame of mind, which I think is partly creedal, is something one also gets from faith. And if you go up in a mentality without a sense of eschatology, then that's probably just not weirdly in your bones.
Well, I find it ironic that you're going for abstraction. Well, when you've criticized it earlier in this hour, because I feel that that's one of the great, I think our country is both a blessing and a curse to the world, and our creedal belief that we are the last best hope is a very dangerous belief. Has been, I think, a very fraught and difficult one. Although I share with you the fact that as an American, I kind of believe it. Even though I'm a little bit nervous about what it's wrought, in terms of our global influence. So I do think that I remember I knew this elderly friend of mine who was born in Mexico, a naturalized U.S. citizen, which itself is a very interesting term to be naturalized. It's kind of the born again. You get born again, and he speaks about our founders. Our founders, and it's a beautiful reminder of how powerful solidarity can be. That it can make us anew, and I think that this is an ongoing need that we have to be always renewed. I mean, we have liturgies in the church where we come together for Mass, and it's a dangerous thing to think of a nation as a church. It's a right American temptation, but I do think some sense of our ritual belonging, which is actually pretty powerful in the United States. Football games, this kind of blows my mind. Everybody stands, sings the national anthems, gives my foreign friends the creeps. What's with all the flags, big giant American flag as big as the entire football field? They get very nervous about that. And then the kind of crude chanting after 9/11, USA, USA, that also put my European friends very much on edge. And I think one of the dangers we face is if we impoverish, or if the public realm is deprived of sophisticated ways to express this civic love, which I think is a very, very fundamental human need, it'll find crude expressions. And that's actually where the danger lies. The dangers of nationalism are the dangers that come from depriving people of more noble ways to express a love that is native to all of us, to love our homeland, or the place that in some sense gives us birth, whether it's our birth in a literal sense or whether it's our certain kind of rebirth that comes from being naturalized and accepting and affirming and wanting to be part of a place.
We have a few more minutes. If there is something that you want to address, something that bothered you here or something that struck you here.
You go, Rusty?
Well, I think the theme of the event about reality not failing us, but we certainly can fail.
We're pretty good at that.
We're very good at that. We're very good at that. And I think one of the features of the human condition is to actually refuse. It's this perverse refusal of the blessings of life that I think is one of the one way of characterizing the fall. That we fall again and again in a certain sense in Adam and Eve. We refuse, and we refuse in so many moments of our life to accept what I call this sort of the blessing of the given, which is not just the givenness of a certain cultural pattern, which of course needs to be thought about and oftentimes reformed, but just the sheer givenness of the beauty of the created world.
I guess I'll talk about reality since that's our theme here. And let me start by asking people to raise their hands if they've been to Israel. So that's, more than I thought. Maybe a third, maybe 20%. And I recommend going if you take Christ seriously, because walking the streets of Jerusalem, going to Galilee, you see the thousands of years of conflict and the pressures of human difference and rivalry into which he walked. And I think you get a grittier sense of how it all went down. And so it introduces reality and cures anyone of the danger of over-spiritualizing. And I sometimes go especially to Christian colleges, Protestant Christian colleges, and say they're wonderful places, I love going to them. But if there's a weakness to them, it's this combination of a spiritual superiority complex combined with an intellectual inferiority complex. And sometimes the result, an over-spiritualization of things. And when I see the young graduates sometimes floundering, I sometimes think, would it hurt you to be clever once a week? Because everything becomes spiritual and waiting. And that sometimes can lead to an over-spiritual, which a visit to the Holy Land cures you of. For the rest of the culture, of course, the problem is under-spiritualization. And I confess, when I arrived here yesterday, I looked at does reality, I forget what the theme is, does reality defeat us, or whatever it is. Does reality oh, it's up there. Reality has never betrayed me. Not my rental reality is often betraying me. But I do see the multiple layers of reality as the theme here, and especially the non-physical reality. And I'll just end with this. This is also an idea I've stolen. But we keep talking about this longing for spiritual fullness and for quiet and for holiness. And the way I am concrete because I'm a journalist, and the metaphor I use is like you're in the forest and there's that part of you that's reclusive, and it's like a leopard that's up in the hills in the snow. And it's the part of you that doesn't care about Facebook and it doesn't care about material things or status. It's the part that hungers for this holiness. And often when you're in your 20s and you're trying to make a life and be busy or raise kids, the leopard is just up there somewhere. And then sometimes it comes down and presents itself to you. Christian Wyman, who was here last year, has a great phrase, in the middle of the night, sometimes you wake up and your thoughts are like a drawer full of knives. And at those moments, the leopard is like saying, hey, I'm here. And some moments of great joy, like with my kids in the backyard, the leopard is there. Some moments of great suffering. But then you hit a certain point in life, and I really think it can be at 22, 52, or 72, when the leopard just comes out of the mountains and sits there right in front of you and asks for justification. Why are you here? To what were you called? What did you do? Who did you help? Who did you love? And a lot of people who've never thought about those questions have to face that awful reality and spend the rest of their life avoiding it. And then a lot of people, most of us, have thought about them a little and we continue to struggle, but that moment of confrontation when the mask has to fall does happen. And that is a reality that we're unprepared for until it actually happens to us. But I do think that is the sort of invisible reality, the higher Platonic reality that has sort of been flowed in through the 2 days.
Well, thanks for sharing, both of you. Thank you, David Brooks. Thank you, Rusty Reno. And please. Well, you know, the encounter is coming to an end, but it's evident that it's a beginning. And there's a, sharing is a reflection of hope. Your desires are no stranger to me. Your questions are no enemy to me. And hope, Father Giussani would say, is certainty in the future based on something present now. and what we experience through the weekend is real. Reality does not betray us. For those who've been here the whole weekend, we all know that pianos can betray us. We had a serious problem on night one with the piano. But really, this is our beginning. And we want to end this moment, bear with us, with a very quick award ceremony. You know, for the first year, the New York Encounter launched a poetry contest. And it received an amazing response of more than 500 submissions. Christian Wyman, who was here with us last year, having been appointed the ultimate judge, has picked 2 works. And I'm inviting right now Kathleen O'Toole and James Davis May to come here and share with us their work.
I'm the 3rd prize winner. You'll hear from the 1st prize winner afterwards. I want to thank Image Journal and New York Encounter for this honor, and Greg Wolf and Rita Simmons and Christian Wyman for selecting this poem. We were told we could take 2 minutes to frame the poems, and I was trained well. I want to say 3 things. One was that my poem was written on a poetry residency in Auvillard, France, which providentially for me turned out to be a small village that is on the chemin, the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, so that every day I was encountering pilgrims, and that's very much in the background of this poem. And the encounter which it describes with a painter and his creation, there's a word that weighs heavily on the poem, the void. And I should probably say that this conversation I refer to happened in French, and I don't remember the word that the painter used. So I went back looking, and it could have been vide, emptiness. It could have been néant, nothingness. I think not in the sense that Father Julian referred to emptiness in his talk, but really in the kind of encounter which creates awe, or that arrests you, in which you have to pay attention. So it doesn't matter. It stopped me, and that encounter gave birth to the poem. At the Mariners' Chapel, Auvillard, St. Catherine, carved in white marble, vigils over the remains of a church once filled with grateful gifts from sailors who thanked her for their safe return. Today, between a timbered ceiling and the cool embrace of undecorated granite, mysterious landscape paintings grace the walls. Scenes of fog with dark lines of mast or bow, yellow orbs that suggest sun, brown brushstrokes of bird feather, impressions of distorted angel wings. The artist is reading a book. I approach to ask him, myself perhaps too, how much of what has emerged to shimmer indistinct on these canvases was born of clear intent, how much the random encounter of paint and canvas, an emergence absent the strong arm of will. Where, I wonder, has the ego yielded lines to shadowing, a palette of sun and gathering clouds into feathering, flight. His reply, tossed like a pebble, echoes. Does it not all come from the void? myself at the well's rim, listening. Thank you.
Poets aren't normally drastically outnumbered by their audiences, so thank you for sticking around. As Kathleen said, I need to be quick. I wanted to very quickly thank Christian Wyman for selecting this poem, and thank the New York Encounter for finding a place for poetry. And I should thank them, too, for finding a place for real and meaningful discourse. About this poem, my first book was published last year, and it's a happy book. It's probably about being captured by life. And it was published, I said, in March, and I started working on a series of poems right after that imagine my damnation with various heroes of mine. So it's not so happy. Clarence Darrow, the attorney for the Scopes-Bunkie trial and a number of other major trials, he represented a lot of awful people, murderers, people who really didn't deserve any compassion, and yet I've been sort of haunted and inspired by the way he was able to represent them, but also represent them passionately. So this poem is called Damnation with Clarence Darrow, and I think that's all you need to know. Damnation with Clarence Darrow. My fear is that for pride and vanity and argument, I will be placed with him not in, but above that sulphurous hell neither of us believed in. That we will both be exiled to a soundproof cell suspended like an ornament from a neglected redbud branch. Think two goldfish pacing a carnival bag gripped in a child's hand, our magnified mouths moving mutely to those outside. Inside, his defenses of the damned below him, the lunatic who murdered the mayor, the friends who bashed in the rich kid's skull for fun, come to nothing but their snapping necks, what in his time was called a dose of hemp. Meanwhile, looking up to the world, I'll make some case for myself, how I loved it all, like, say, that evening in the Blue Ridge, when the first wood thrush of the summer began its internal duet, singing two notes at once, and my wife and I listened and only listened while our daughter slept, a wanting of nothing else but the moment, that definition of happiness I defended. But then some winged century will interrupt, its reptilian fingers holding open the door. Yes, you defended that definition fiercely as your hero here, the litigator, defended the guilty. With high rhetoric, he turned evil into something human, while you were always colder than your words and confused what you sang for what happened. Spasms of volcanic ash in the distance as the demon hovers outside our cell. Here are the punishments. He will make forever convincing arguments that do not win, and your song will convince, but only you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to our poets. Thank you, David. Thank you, Rusty. Be back here at 6. We will surprise you with something special. But again, let's thank our guests again. And see you later.